The village of Stonybrook had always been a place where little changed. Its cobbled streets wound past ivy-clad cottages, and the church bells rang with a punctuality that marked the passing of the seasons as faithfully as the turning of a clock. For a newcomer, it might have seemed sleepy, even mundane, but those who had lived there for generations knew that beneath the primroses and neatly clipped hedges lay rivalries, resentments, and secrets that often spoke louder than the chattering village gossip. Miss Jane, seated in the window of her snug sitting room, watched the late afternoon sun filter through the lace curtains. Her knitting lay untouched on her lap, as her sharp eyes followed the postman making his rounds. The tranquility of the village was a balm for her mind, yet she knew from experience that peace was often a delicate veneer. A keen observer of human nature, Miss Marple had long learned that the most serene of places could harbour the most unexpected of tragedies. It was on a bright Thursday morning that the incident occurred which would rouse the village from its habitual calm. Miss Marple had been invited by Lady Mildred Havisham, the formidable mistress of Havisham Manor, to attend a small garden party in honour of her late husband's birthday. Lady Mildred, now in her 60s but still exuding an air of austere elegance, had insisted that only a select few would attend, promising a day of refined conversation and delicate teas. Beneath the great oak tree that stood sentinel in the manor's sprawling grounds, Miss Marple arrived promptly, her sensible walking shoes crunching on the gravel, her hat pinned with a discreet sprig of lavender, a gift from her own garden. She was greeted at the manor gates by Thomas Ellery, the steward, a tall, taciturn man whose precise manners seemed to belong more to a gentleman's club than a rural estate. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly. "Lady Mildred awaits you in the drawing-room." The drawing-room was awash with sunlight, the polished wood gleaming, and the scent of fresh roses mingling with the faint aroma of brewing tea. Lady Mildred rose to greet her, her sharp eyes glinting behind a pair of spectacles perched on the end of her nose. "Ah, Jane, so pleased you could come," she said, her voice precise, almost clipped. "We are gathered to commemorate my late husband, though I confess some of the guests are more concerned with the teas and cakes than with sentimentality." She allowed herself a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The guests assembled were a carefully curated mix of village notables and family friends. Reverend Edward Chalmers, the kindly vicar with a penchant for quoting Latin, stood quietly by the mantelpiece. Miss Claudia Farrow, a young woman with an air of cultivated nervousness, fiddled with the hem of her gloves. Henry Packard, a local solicitor, polished his spectacles as he observed the room, and Margaret Linley, Lady Mildred's niece, fluttered about with barely restrained curiosity, examining the silverware and the silver tea service as though inspecting treasures in a museum. Miss Mop, as was her habit, observed everything with quiet attention. The careful way Reverend Chalmers shifted his weight, the tension in Claudia Farrow's posture, the ever-so-slight smirk on Henry Packard's face all spoke volumes. Though the casual observer might notice nothing, tea was served in the garden, beneath the great oak tree whose wide branches spread like a protective canopy over the manicured lawns. The gentle rustling of leaves accompanied the soft hum of conversation. Lady Mildred presided over the proceedings with the authority of a matriarch, guiding the discussion from horticulture to the latest village news. The cakes were delicate, the tea fragrant, and the day seemed to hold all the promise of simple pleasure. Yet even in this idyllic setting, Miss Marple felt the subtle currents of tension beneath the polite chatter. A remark here, a glance there, and the mind of a seasoned observer could begin to trace the outline of hidden motives. It was after the second round of tea that the perhaps inciting incident occurred. Margaret Linley had wandered a little too close to the ancient oak tree, and with a sudden exclamation, she stumbled back, pointing to the base of the tree. "Oh heavens!" she cried. "There's someone lying there." A hush fell over the gathering. Lady Mildred's expression tightened, her grip on her teacup firm. Miss Marple, who had been seated in her usual corner, rose with composed alacrity and approached the scene. Beneath the sprawling roots of the oak lay a figure, pale and still. It was Reginald Havisham, Lady Mildred's late husband's distant cousin, a man known for his impecunious lifestyle and persistent presence at every family gathering, often uninvited. His eyes were closed, and a faint, unnatural angle of his head suggested that his demise had not been peaceful. Reverend Chalmers knelt immediately, checking for signs of life. "I'm afraid he's dead," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the shocked gasps of the guests. The tranquility of Stonybrook was shattered in an instant. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She bent slightly to observe the body, noting the position of the hands, the slight indentation in the ground beneath the oak, and the absence of any blood. Her mind, as always, began to work methodically, cataloguing the scene as if she were arranging the pieces of a puzzle. Was he standing here? She inquired, her voice gentle but firm. Or perhaps, seated on the bench over there? Thomas Ellery stepped forward. He was found here, Miss Marple, by Miss Linley. He faltered, unsure of what words could adequately convey the strangeness of the moment. Miss Marple straightened, her eyes scanning the guests. It will be prudent to remain calm. The authorities will arrive shortly. But in the meantime, we must not disturb anything. Margaret Linley clutched Lady Mildred's arm, her face pale. Do you think it was an accident? Miss Marple considered the scene carefully, noting the scattered leaves, the slightly worn patch of soil at the base of the oak, and the careful way in which the branches arched above. Accidents, she thought, were often too conveniently timed. As the local constable arrived, summoned post-haste by Thomas Ellery, Miss Marple lingered near the oak tree, observing details others overlooked. The faint trace of soil on Reginald's cuff, the angle of the watch on his wrist, even the way the sunlight fell across the roots, it all contributed to a picture that would, she suspected, reveal more than it initially seemed. Lady Mildred approached her quietly, a hint of apprehension in her eyes. Jane, you have always had a remarkable insight. Can you tell me if this was truly an accident? Miss Marple offered a small, enigmatic smile. My dear Lady Mildred, the answer rarely lies in what we see at first glance. It is in the subtleties, in the small details others dismiss, that the truth often hides. And so, beneath the venerable oak tree of Havisham Manor, the stage was set. A death had occurred, quiet but undeniably sinister, and the gentle rhythms of Stonybrook were about to be interrupted by a careful, deliberate investigation. Miss Marple, with her intuitive understanding of human nature, would soon begin to unravel a web of secrets, lies, and hidden motives, each one as intricate as the branches of the very oak beneath which Reginald Havisham had met his untimely end. The following morning, Stonybrook awoke to an air of hushed speculation. The news of Reginald Havisham's death had spread swiftly, though only through whispers and discreet inquiries. Villagers peeked from behind curtains, exchanging uncertain glances, while the post office buzzed with half-formed theories. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She rose early, dressed in a modest grey dress with a neat collar and a shawl pinned across her shoulders, and took her customary stroll through the village before breakfast. The dew still clung to the hedge, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the faint aroma of peat fires. Even the smallest details caught her attention. A pair of bootprints that seemed oddly familiar, a gate swinging slightly on its hinges, though no one had passed through it recently, and the subtle tension in the mannerisms of those she passed. In her experience, such observations were seldom meaningless. By mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself back at Havisham Manor. The grand house, with its ivy-draped walls and stately windows, seemed to carry a sombre weight. Lady Mildred met her at the door, her expression both anxious and relieved to see a trusted friend. Jane, she said quietly, I hardly know where to begin. The constable is thorough, as you might expect, but I feel that someone should have a clearer sense of what might have happened. Miss Marple inclined her head. The clarity, my dear Lady Mildred, rarely arrives at the same pace as shock, but I will do what I can. The first step, as Miss Marple knew, was to observe the scene again. She made her way to the oak tree, now cordoned off with modest lengths of twine, the soil slightly disturbed by the previous day's examination. Carefully, she crouched and examined the base, noting once more the impressions of boots, the scattered leaves, and the faint smudge of soil on the roots. They must have overlooked this yesterday, she murmured to herself, gesturing to a small indentation in the earth. It was irregular, not quite consistent with someone simply having fallen, a struggle perhaps, or a staged stumble. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Ellery, who approached with his usual quiet efficiency. Miss Marple, the guests are assembling in the drawing-room, he said. Perhaps it would be wise to begin the formal inquiries there. The drawing-room had taken on a markedly different atmosphere from the previous day's garden party. The polished wood seemed gloomier under the morning light, and the scent of tea was replaced with faint traces of anxiety. Miss Marple seated herself near the hearth, while the assembled suspects fidgeted. their faces betraying unease beneath carefully maintained civility. Miss Marple began with casual conversation, a tactic she often employed to ease tension while collecting clues. "Reverend Chalmers, how have you been coping with yesterday's shock?" she asked. The vicar adjusted his spectacles and gave a small, rueful smile. "It is difficult, of course." Reginald was, well, one never knows what to expect from such a man. Still, death is never convenient. Miss Marple nodded, allowing her gaze to linger a moment longer than politeness might dictate. She noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, and the way his eyes shifted whenever he mentioned the Havisham estate. It was a small detail, yet not insignificant. Next, she addressed Miss Claudia Farrow, the young woman whose nervousness had been evident during the garden party. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I observed you yesterday. You seemed troubled. Might you share your thoughts?" Claudia's fingers twisted in her lap. I didn't see much, really. I only saw him lying there. I suppose I was frightened. He could be a bit unpleasant at times." Her words trailed off, and her eyes darted toward Margaret Linley, who sat with an expression of studied detachment. Miss Marple made a mental note. Fear, though instinctual, often reveals the boundaries of hidden knowledge. If Claudia had seen something or someone, she would eventually speak. Once she felt safe. Henry Packard, the solicitor, fidgeted with his spectacles next. "It is most irregular," he said, his tone clipped. Reginald was not a violent man, at least not openly, yet one cannot discount opportunity. He allowed the words to hang, neither confirming nor denying suspicion, but implying that motive and means were worth consideration. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "Opportunities are often easier to conceal than motives. One must watch both." It was then that Margaret Linley spoke, her voice measured, yet curious. "I wonder, why would anyone wish him ill? He was difficult, yes, but hardly a man to kill over a mere slight." Miss Marple considered this, her eyes narrowing slightly. But my dear, the smallest slight may, in certain circumstances, become the most grievous offense, and sometimes it is not the person, but the circumstance, that tips a situation into tragedy." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Whitcomb, a methodical man with a penchant for detail, who had come from the county seat to oversee the investigation. He carried a notebook, his expression stern. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "We will need to interview each of you formally, but I understand Miss Marple has been examining the scene." He gave a subtle nod in her direction. "I welcome any observations you might have." Miss Marple inclined her head gracefully. "I have noted a few small irregularities, Inspector, which may or may not prove significant. One must always allow for the unexpected in such matters." Inspector Whitcomb made a note in his book, while Miss Marple subtly observed the reactions of the other guests. Claudia's lips pressed tightly together. Margaret Linley's eyes flickered with curiosity. Reverend Chalmers' hands tightened over his prayer beads. Henry Packard's jaw tensed. Once the inspector departed to examine the scene again, Miss Marple began her private inquiries. She spoke first with Thomas Ellery, who had access to the movements of all within the manor. "Thomas," she asked softly, "can you account for everyone's whereabouts yesterday, particularly around the time Reginald arrived in the garden?" Ellery nodded, somewhat reluctantly. "I kept track, of course. Lady Mildred was with her guests at the tea tables. Miss Linley was wandering, as she always does. Claudia remained near the house. Reverend Chalmers moved about the grounds, tending to minor arrangements. Well, he was ostensibly with Lady Mildred, but I did see him near the oak moments before the incident." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Near the oak, you say? And did anyone observe his movements?" "No one, Miss Marple," Ellery admitted, "but he did seem distracted." Her mind turned over the details. The solicitor near the oak, the young woman's nervousness, the vicar's shifting glances, these were threads. Pull on one, and the others might unravel in time. Later in the morning, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the orchard adjacent to the manor. The crisp air and the scent of ripening apples gave her a moment to think. As she walked, she observed a few more details. The faint scuff marks near the edge of the grass, a loose scarf caught in a branch, and the subtle angle of shadows cast by the rising sun. Each observation was catalogued, carefully stored for later reflection. Returning to the drawing room, she requested private conversations with each guest. One by one, she spoke with them, using gentle questioning and the occasional innocuous remark to draw out the truth. She listened for inconsistencies, the half-truths and silences that often betrayed a guilty conscience, or at least the knowledge of secrets best left unspoken. With Claudia Farrow, she discovered that the young woman had indeed seen a fleeting figure near the oak before Reginald's fall, though she could not clearly identify who it was. With Margaret Linley, she learned that the niece had overheard a heated exchange between her uncle and another guest the previous evening, words that hinted at money, inheritance, and grudges long buried. Reverend Chalmers, upon gentle probing, revealed his unease over certain affairs of the Havisham estate, including disputes over property lines and old debts, though he insisted he had no personal stake in the matter. Henry Packard, ever cautious, admitted to being near the oak, but insisted he had merely intended to retrieve a fallen glove belonging to Lady Mildred. His explanations, however, contained a hesitation, a subtle pause that Miss Marple noted carefully. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had accumulated a considerable array of observations. She returned to her favourite window seat in the drawing-room, reflecting quietly. Each guest, each witness, each small clue to disturbed soil, the scuffed boots, the loose scarf, the whispered arguments formed pieces of a complex puzzle. She allowed herself a small, wry smile. In all her years observing human nature, she had learned that the most ordinary-seeming individuals often harboured extraordinary secrets, and in Stonybrook, beneath the veneer of civility and politeness, there were layers yet to be uncovered. As evening fell, the manor took on a sombre quiet. The guests retired to their rooms or to the drawing-room, subdued yet restless. Miss Marple, however, felt a thrill of anticipation. The investigation had begun, the threads were in motion, and already she could sense the contours of a truth that lay hidden, waiting to be revealed. For Miss Marple, the work was only just beginning. Beneath the oak tree, the scene of Reginald Havisham's untimely death, secrets were waiting to be unearthed, and with patient observation, careful questioning, and that subtle understanding of human nature that had served her so well in the past, she would soon begin to uncover the tangled web that led to murder. The morning after the initial inquiries, a heavy mist clung to the village of Stonybrook, curling around the hedgerows and the ivy-clad cottages like a soft, shrouding veil. The atmosphere, as Miss Marple had long learned, often mirrored the undercurrents of tension among those involved in a mystery. Beneath that silver fog, truths and deceptions alike seemed to hover, waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple arrived at Havisham Manor with a quiet sense of purpose. The previous day's examinations had yielded small but important observations, yet the full picture remained elusive. The guests were still lodged in the manor, under polite scrutiny, while Inspector Whitcomb reviewed the statements he had gathered. Miss Marple knew that in moments like these, the ordinary details, forgotten phrases, slight hesitations, trivial gestures were often far more revealing than outright confessions. Her first stop was the drawing-room, now subdued in its morning light. Lady Mildred, impeccably dressed in a navy suit with a string of pearls, was seated near the fire, a teacup in hand. She looked at Miss Marple with an expression of both trust and uncertainty. "Jane," she murmured, "I am grateful for your presence. I cannot imagine navigating this without you." Miss Marple inclined her head, giving only a small, discreet smile. "Patience, my dear. The threads are already beginning to unravel, though we must be careful not to jump to conclusions." Before she could proceed, the household steward, Thomas Ellery, appeared at the door, carrying a small parcel. "Miss Marple," he said, "this arrived for you earlier. It is from the village post, though no sender is indicated." Curious, Miss Marple opened the parcel carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a single, pressed flower violet. The note read, "Look closely at what is often overlooked. The truth hides in plain sight." Her lips curved into a faint smile. It was a warning, perhaps a threat, but more likely a clue from someone in the village, someone who knew of her presence and abilities. The first twist came when Miss Marple revisited the scene beneath the oak tree. Inspector Whitcomb had agreed to allow her a private inspection. The base of the tree seemed unchanged, yet her careful eyes detected the faintest impressions in the soil. A small footprint, not entirely matching any of the guests' shoes, partially obscured by leaves. The boot itself was narrow and delicate, more likely a woman's than a man's. "This was overlooked yesterday," she murmured softly, or deliberately ignored. Returning to the manor, she decided it was time to speak privately with each guest once more, but with a subtle shift in strategy. Rather than asking direct questions, she began to observe reactions to seemingly unrelated statements, a technique she had perfected over many cases. When she mentioned casually that certain heirlooms in the manor had recently been appraised, Margaret Linley's eyes flickered with interest. I hadn't realized," she murmured, "but Reginald did seem rather keen on certain items, though he rarely acted on it." Miss Marple noted this carefully. The question of inheritance, or valuable possessions, might not have been immediately relevant, yet human greed often spoke in gestures and hesitation long before words. Meanwhile, new information arrived from the village itself. The baker, a kindly man with flour-streaked hands, reported seeing someone loitering near the manor the previous evening. His description was vague, a figure in a dark coat, moving cautiously along the path. Miss Marple cross-referenced this with the movements of the guests and found a discrepancy. Someone had a reason to be near the oak tree before the incident, she mused, and it was not among the individuals we have accounted for. Her attention returned to Claudia Farrow, who had been increasingly anxious in her presence. With gentle coaxing, Miss Marple learned that Claudia had overheard a hushed argument between Reginald and Henry Packard the evening before the garden party. The argument, concerning property and a possible debt, had been interrupted by Lady Mildred, who sent the men away before its conclusion. Claudia's revelation presented a second twist. Henry Packard's motives were now more complicated. Not merely a passive observer or a solicitor fulfilling his duties, he had been drawn into conflict over matters of inheritance. At the same time, a small but critical clue emerged from the manor's library. A book on British flora, lying open on a side table, revealed pressed leaves tucked between the pages identical in type to the violet, found in the mysterious parcel sent to Miss Marple. It was as if someone was signaling that nature itself held the answer. By mid-afternoon, the investigation had become increasingly tangled. Miss Marple arranged for a discreet gathering in the drawing-room. "Gentlefolk," she began, "I have been reflecting on certain inconsistencies. Some actions yesterday seemed out of place, some words ill-timed, and some movements peculiar. I do not yet have the full answer, but I hope to understand better with your cooperation." Lady Mildred, always poised, inclined her head. "Of course, Jane, I trust your judgment entirely." Miss Marple's attention turned to Reverend Chalmers. "Edward, there was something you mentioned yesterday about the estate's property lines. Could you clarify?" The vicar hesitated. "Well, yes, I suppose. There are long-standing disputes over certain parcels, though I cannot imagine they would lead to this, and yet," Miss Marple pressed gently, "those disputes might provoke a strong emotion in someone. Anger, jealousy, even desperation." Across the room, Claudia Farrow's hands trembled slightly, and Margaret Linley's expression shifted, curiosity mixed with unease. That evening, as the fog thickened and lanterns cast flickering shadows across the manor grounds, a dramatic turn occurred. A servant rushed into the drawing-room, breathless. "Lady Mildred, you must come quickly. There's been another incident near the west garden wall." Miss Marple followed swiftly, along with Lady Mildred and Inspector Whit. There, in a quiet corner of the garden, lay evidence of tampering, footprints leading to a loose stone in the wall, which had been moved to obscure a small compartment beneath. Inside were letters threatening notes addressed to Reginald, each written in a careful feminine hand. "This," Miss Marple said quietly, examining the papers, "was no accident. Someone wanted these messages concealed, yet they underestimated the persistence of observation. The red herrings multiplied. One note implied jealousy, another greed, another revenge for a past grievance. Each seemed plausible, yet Miss Marple sensed that they were designed to mislead, to distract from the true motive and the person responsible. Back in the drawing-room, she began piecing together the fragments. Margaret Linley admitted to visiting the West Garden that afternoon, ostensibly to gather flowers, but her nervous behavior betrayed more than she claimed. Claudia Farrow, now calmer, confirmed seeing Margaret near the oak earlier than she had previously disclosed. Even Reverend Chalmers' prior knowledge of disputes hinted at awareness of conflicts he had not fully shared, and Henry Packard, his sudden defensiveness over the letters, combined with the earlier argument, positioned him as both a suspect and a plausible scapegoat. By nightfall, the manor was steeped in tension. Guests retired to their rooms, whispers echoing along the corridors. Miss Marple, however, remained at her window, observing the estate under the pale light of the moon. The oak tree stood as a silent sentinel, its roots twisted and gnarled, hiding truths beneath. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Twists and red herrings were essential in the dance of deduction. The purpose was not merely to confuse, but to reveal character, to uncover the subtleties of human behavior, the inconsistencies, the hidden notes, the furtive movements. All were pieces of a puzzle. Her mind wandered back to the violet, the footprint, and the disturbed soil beneath the oak. The letters, the disputes, the hidden resentments, they were threads she would follow carefully. Someone in Havisham Manor had taken a deliberate step, and Miss Marple was beginning to understand why. As she retired to her room that night, she penned a few observations in her notebook. Each line captured not just facts, but impressions, the hesitations, the tremors, the fleeting glances. All of them, she knew, were the keys to revealing the culprit. Beneath the oak tree, secrets lay buried, but Miss Marple was patient. The twists had multiplied, the red herrings obscured the truth, yet in the quiet contemplation of a sharp mind and keen eye, the path toward revelation was steadily forming. The morning sun rose over Havisham Manor, casting a soft golden light across the manicured lawns and the great oak tree, whose gnarled roots had become the silent witness to a murder. The village of Stonybrook, still hushed with unease, seemed to hold its breath as the day began. Miss Marple, dressed in her customary modest grey dress and well-worn shoes, took a slow walk through the gardens, her mind working quietly yet relentlessly. In the quiet hours of the morning, she reflected on the patterns she had observed. Small details, seemingly insignificant when first noted: the displaced soil, the faint footprint, the loose stone in the wall, the letters hidden beneath it all, formed a tapestry of subtle clues. She had listened carefully to each confession and hesitation, each carefully chosen word, and each unguarded glance. The solution, as often was the case, lay not in the grand gestures, but in the minutiae. Her first visit was to Lady Mildred, who awaited her in the drawing-room, a cup of tea trembling slightly in her hand. "Jane," she began, voice low and hesitant, have you any idea who could have done this?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to navigating human nature. "Patience, my dear Lady Mildred. The truth is coming into focus. It is a matter of observing carefully, and of knowing where to look and where to wait." Lady Mildred nodded, a mixture of relief and apprehension passing over her features, but Miss Marple began her methodical examination of the key suspects once more. Now, with the insights gleaned from the past 2 days, she started with Henry Packard, the solicitor whose earlier argument with Reginald had hinted at a potential motive. Henry was meticulous, upright, and defensive, traits that could conceal both guilt and innocence. "I have been considering the letters found in the wall," Miss Marple said, her tone casual, almost conversational. "They seem intended to frighten, to mislead, but not necessarily written by the murderer. Do you have any thoughts on that?" Henry adjusted his spectacles, his fingers tightening briefly on the frames. I cannot say. I only know what I have observed. It is possible someone sought to direct suspicion toward me, though I would not have harmed Reginald." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on him, noting the subtle hesitation, the brief avoidance of eye contact. "Fear often speaks as clearly as action, Mr. Packard, and yet there is one detail I find curious." She did not elaborate, but Henry's sudden pallor betrayed recognition. Next, she turned to Margaret Linley, whose fascination with the manor and its secrets had been evident from the start. Margaret had been near the oak tree at the time of the incident, and her nervous behavior suggested she knew more than she initially admitted. "Margaret," Miss Marple said softly, "you told me yesterday about hearing an argument, and that you had been near the oak. You also found the letters hidden near the west wall. Yet I suspect there is more you have not yet shared." Margaret's fingers twisted together. I did see someone near the tree," she confessed, "but I did not see clearly who it was. I thought it best not to mention it, for fear of making matters worse." Miss Marple's mind catalogued the information. Margaret's reluctance to speak suggested either fear or complicity, but the detail about witnessing someone else near the tree was key. It was in a quiet moment, while walking alone in the manor's orchard, that Miss Marple had a flash of clarity. The footprint beneath the oak had been delicate, almost feminine. The letters had been written in a careful hand, not in the hasty scrawl of a man in panic. The threats were personal, targeted, yet designed to mislead. Someone had orchestrated the scene to imply a struggle, to suggest an accident, and to direct suspicion away from themselves. The connections began to crystallize in her mind. Claudia Farrow, nervous and timid, had seen the shadowed figure. Margaret had been near the oak, but was not the primary actor. Henry Packard's dispute with Reginald was indeed over property, but not the ultimate motive for murder. There was someone else, whose presence had been subtle yet consistent, whose interactions with all others were understated but significant. Her thoughts returned to Lady Mildred. The matriarch of Havisham Manor, reserved yet meticulous, had access, influence, and knowledge. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the key lay not in Lady Mildred's own actions, but in those she protected, or feared might be exposed. It was the pattern of concealment that clinched the revelation. Only someone with both intimate knowledge of the manor and careful understanding of human nature could orchestrate such a scene, place Reginald in the exact position, manipulate the letters, create red herrings, and allow the other's movements to disguise the true sequence of events. Miss Marple called for the household to assemble once more in the drawing-room. The air was thick with anticipation, as if even the walls held their breath. She began, as always, gently. Yesterday, Reginald Havisham met an untimely end beneath the oak tree. It was a scene of apparent accident, yet several details suggested otherwise. The footprint at the base of the tree, delicate and narrow, was overlooked by most. Letters, hidden near the west wall, were intended to mislead. Certain witnesses observed movements inconsistent with their explanations. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. In short, the truth was hidden in plain sight, obscured by assumptions, by fear, and by deliberate redirection. A hush fell over the room. Even Lady Mildred, composed as ever, seemed to sense the turning point of events. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm yet incisive. It was not Henry Packard who struck Reginald, nor Margaret Linley who orchestrated the letters. The primary actor, the one whose actions culminated in his death, was. She let the suspense build, eyes sweeping across the group. Claudia Farrow, she said quietly. The young woman gasped, covering her mouth. No, I didn't. You acted out of fear and desperation. Miss Marple interrupted gently. You knew of Reginald's persistent demands and threats, and in a moment of panic, you caused him to fall beneath the oak. The letters were an attempt to mislead, to disguise your involvement. Inspector Whitcomb stepped forward, expression taut. Miss Farrow, do you admit this? Claudia's shoulders slumped, tears brimming. Yes, it was an accident. I did not intend to kill him, but I feared what he might do. I moved him. I thought, I only wanted him to leave me be. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze compassionate. Fear can lead to unintended consequences. My dear, the important thing is that the truth is now known, and justice can proceed. As the confessions settled over the room, Miss Marple turned her attention to the red herrings she had identified. The argument between Henry Packard and Reginald, while genuine, was not the cause of death. Margaret Linley's proximity was coincidental. Reverend Chalmers' unease stemmed from his knowledge of estate disputes rather than any malicious intent. All the pieces now fell into place beneath the oak tree, like the branches of a sprawling puzzle finally aligned. Lady Mildred, though saddened, expressed relief. Jane, your insight. I do not know how to thank you. This would have been impossible without your presence. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Observation, patience, an understanding of human nature. Lady Mildred, that is all it requires. The day wore on with the household slowly regaining a sense of order. Inspector Whitcomb arranged for Claudia Farrow to be escorted appropriately, while the rest of the guests resumed their places within the manor, relieved that the tension and uncertainty had been resolved. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, reflecting on the events. The oak tree, now silent once more, had witnessed fear, desperation, and ultimately, truth. She sipped her tea and allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. The village, though shaken, would resume its gentle rhythms, and beneath it all, the lessons remained. The smallest details often revealed the greatest truths, and human nature, in its many forms, was both the source of mischief and the key to understanding. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the subtleties of fear and desperation, of intention and accident. The threads of the day had woven together to reveal a picture she had glimpsed from the beginning, but only the careful accumulation of observations had allowed her to see clearly. That she set her teacup aside, and gazed out the window at the golden light bathing the manor gardens. She allowed herself a faint, wry smile. The oak tree had hidden its secret well, yet no detail, however small, had escaped her notice. The mystery was solved not by rash action, but by patience, insight, and the quiet power of observation. The sun rose on Stony Brook in a soft, golden haze, illuminating the village and the manor with a sense of serenity that had been absent for days. The murder beneath the oak tree was no longer a mystery, but a lesson in human nature, carefully unraveled by Miss Marple's gentle persistence. The villagers, who had spent the past days whispering, speculating, and watching, now moved with a subdued relief. Even the postman seemed lighter of step, no longer fearing the gossip he carried might lead to tragedy. Miss Marple herself began the day with a quiet stroll around Havisham Manor, observing the gardens, the Douladen paths, and the sturdy oak tree now standing as both witness and memorial. It was remarkable how swiftly tension could dissipate once the truth was known, leaving only the natural rhythm of life in its place. Lady Mildred awaited her in the drawing-room, impeccably dressed in a deep green gown that matched the ivy climbing the walls outside. She greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of gratitude and lingering concern. "Jane," she said softly, "I cannot thank you enough for what you have done. It is as though a shadow has lifted from this house." Miss Marple inclined her head with a faint smile. "Shadows, my dear Lady Mildred, are never permanent. They retreat in the presence of clarity and observation." The first task of the morning was the formal explanation of events, which Miss Marple undertook with her customary combination of wit and precision. She gathered all concerned, the household, the guests, and Inspector Whitcomb in the drawing-room once more. The room, still bathed in morning light, seemed less foreboding now, and even the great oak tree outside appeared less ominous, softened by distance and the gentle rustling of its leaves. "Gentlefolk," she began, "the incident beneath the oak tree, tragic though it was, has been fully understood. What seemed at first an accident was, in truth, a result of fear, desperation, and miscalculation." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "Claudia Farrow, who has confessed, acted not out of malice but out of fear of Reginald Havisham's persistent demands and threats. She had no intention to kill, only to protect herself. In doing so, she caused his untimely fall beneath the oak tree. The letters hidden near the west garden wall, the scuff marks, the footprint, and the misdirectional were her attempts, however misguided, to obscure her involvement." Claudia, seated quietly beside Lady Mildred, nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "I was frightened, and I only wanted him to leave me alone." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Fear is a powerful motivator, my dear, but honesty, once admitted, brings clarity and, ultimately, justice." Miss Marple then addressed the other red herrings and misunderstandings. Henry Packard, though involved in a disagreement with Reginald regarding the estate, had no connection to the fall itself. Margaret Linley, while near the oak tree, had acted only out of curiosity and concern. Reverend Chalmers' knowledge of estate disputes and village matters contributed to suspicion, but his intentions were entirely proper. Lady Mildred, of course, sought only to maintain order within her household. In short, each person's actions were observed and understood, but the primary cause, the inadvertent act that led to tragedy, lay with Claudia Farrow. The assembled guests and household exchanged looks of relief, even as they absorbed the sobering nature of the events. While the outcome had been tragic, the explanation brought understanding, and with it, the beginnings of closure. Inspector Whitcomb, ever methodical, spoke next. "Miss Marple, your insights have been invaluable. With this understanding, we can proceed appropriately and ensure that all necessary legal and social responsibilities are observed." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Inspector, truth is a matter not only of discovery but of careful handling. The delicate nature of human relationships requires that justice and compassion coexist." The practical resolution followed. Claudia Farrow, while technically implicated, would not face harsh punishment due to the accidental nature of the event and her immediate confession. Lady Mildred, guided by her own strong moral compass, arranged for Claudia to be supported, ensuring that she had a safe home and employment in another village nearby, along with guidance to prevent similar fear-driven incidents. The household resumed its routines with a renewed sense of calm. Ellery, the steward, oversaw repairs to the garden and the west wall where the letters had been hidden. Margaret Linley returned to her studies and reading in the manor library, reflecting quietly on the events she had witnessed. Henry Packard continued his legal work, reassured that his integrity remained unquestioned. Reverend Chalmers resumed his duties within the parish, offering prayers and guidance to those affected by the tragedy. Even the oak tree, once the silent site of a fall, seemed to regain its dignity, standing tall and strong amidst the gardens, a symbol not only of nature's endurance, but of the clarity that arises when observation and reasoning meet human emotion. Miss Marple herself spent the afternoon in reflection. Tea in hand, she sat in her favourite chair by the drawing-room window, cataloguing the events and the insights they had offered. Her thoughts drifted gently to the villagers, the way they had observed, speculated, and, in their own ways, participated in the unfolding of events. In all her years, she had learned that human nature, contradictory and subtle, was the true puzzle, far more intricate than any plot or scheme. She thought of Claudia, whose fear had inadvertently caused the tragedy, and felt a quiet compassion. It was a reminder that human frailty could manifest in unexpected ways, and that understanding, rather than simple condemnation, was often the wisest path. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, bathing Havisham Manor in a soft amber glow, Miss Marple rose and took one last walk through the gardens. The oak tree, the gentle paths, and the orderly flower beds reflected the restoration of calm, the careful mending of tensions, and the quiet satisfaction of a mystery solved. Lady Mildred appeared at the doorway, offering a small smile. "Jane, you have done more than solve a mystery. You have restored peace to this household and this village. We are deeply grateful." Miss Marple returned the smile, modest yet knowing. "Peace, my dear Lady Mildred, is often the reward for patience, observation, and the willingness to see what others overlook. All else follows naturally." The manor, the village, and even the oak tree itself now rested in a delicate equilibrium, each element of Stony Brook reflecting the quiet truths Miss Marple had uncovered. Guests and villagers alike returned to their routines with the assurance that, despite the shadows cast by human fear and error, clarity and understanding would always prevail. As twilight descended, Miss Marple settled by her window once more, a cup of tea warming her hands. She reflected on the day, on the small clues that had revealed the truth, and on the subtleties of human nature that, if observed carefully, could illuminate even the darkest of mysteries. And with that, Stony Brook returned to its gentle rhythms. The mystery beneath the oak tree resolved, and the lives of all those involved, subtly, irrevocably, changed but restored.